Video games probe our minds in ways that other mediums can't. The interactive element, while not one-to-one with real life, means that players can be put in challenging or thought-provoking situations. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the realm of multiplayer or collaborative games, which can often serve as a window into human behavior. A horrifying window. After all, these sorts of games are sort of like microcosms of human society. So let's take a break from telling others what we think of games and take a look at what games can tell us about ourselves. Where better to start than with the rare game that actually billed itself as a social experiment? Curiosity, What's Inside the Cube, originally announced in August of 2012 with a trailer that prompted more questions than answers. Curiosity was headed by a new studio called 22 Cans, headed by former Microsoft developer Peter Molyneux. The Cube was a giant multiplayer experiment. There were 60 billion cubelets in total, and by tapping, players could remove a single one at a time. The goal was to get to the center, and the lucky player who did would be greeted with a secret that was supposed to be life-changing. Mining cubelets would generate coins that would be used to purchase in-game items like pickaxes, which could destroy multiple squares at once. These items could also be purchased with real money, which led to a rather interesting microtransaction. A diamond chisel able to break 100,000 cubelets at once, worth 3 billion coins, or $80,000. Molyneux himself said, "This is not a money-making exercise. It is a test about the psychology of monetization." At its core, Curiosity was a challenge, like Ready Player One. Can you find the secret? How far are you willing to go for that knowledge? Of course, this is all dependent on what's actually at the center. And, well, some of you may have recognized our lead designer. Peter Molyneux is best known for a few things: the Fable series, several God games like Populous and Black and White, and being a huge fraud. Okay, to cut him some slack, Molyneux's biggest problem is that he is the industry's biggest serial overpromiser. He's kind of rationalized this over the years as being really ambitious and overly communicative with the public, announcing features in his games that would ultimately end up being cut. The tragic thing is that most of his games are actually pretty well received, but in comparison to the mountain that he promises, they look lacking. So it's concerning when he comes out and says things like, "What is inside the cube is life-changingly amazing, by any definition." This Wired article continues, quote, "He fantasizes that on the day the cube is opened, the revelation of its contents will lead nightly newscasts around the world." This has essentially been built up like a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory. Part of it is the anticipation. If everything is over in these days, you haven't had enough time to anticipate. If it could last a month or 2 months, then that anticipation will build up and up and up. And there are all these clues on these layers to what is underneath the cube, and all these plans we've got. We're going to change the rules. How would people respond to this amazing secret? Would they ransom it? Hide it? Share it with the world? We'd find out a whole 10 months after the game's launch, when an 18-year-old living in Edinburgh by the name of Brian Henderson would crack the final cublet. He elected to share with the world the video he was greeted with at the end.
Welcome to the end of Curiosity. We started this experiment back in November of 2012. And we have been completely blown away by how the world has embraced this amazing experiment. And that's exactly what it was, an experiment. Could we take the simplest possible conceivable thing, connecting people together and allowing them to tap on this massive cube, could we take that and pose this question of what's in the center? Now, when we released it, the first real question was, what is inside the cube? And I said, and I'm known for these things, I said there's something amazing inside, something life-changing inside. How can anything be worth all that effort? Well, we could give you a piece of advice. We could say, oh, be nice to people. We could say, here's a wad of cash, but it needs to be more meaningful than that. And so, what is in the center is something that only we can grant. And it is the ability to be a digital god. We are making a game called Godus. The whole game is about being a god to your followers. You, the person who would reach the center, will be the god of all people that are playing Godus. You will intrinsically decide on the rules that the game is played by. And, here's the life-changing bit, you will share in the success of the product. Every time people spend money on Godus, you will get a small piece of that pie. We will follow up with details of what that means. It means that you will decide on how people play a game. You will accrue riches from that game, from the start until the finish of your reign. That, by any definition of the word, is life-changing. You will have fame, you will have fortune, and you will have the power to introduce morals into a game.
So, Curiosity basically amounted to a marketing campaign for their upcoming game Godus. Henderson would be the god of gods, able to fundamentally change aspects of the way the game worked. And he would share in a portion of the profits. So, how did Godus perform? Oh. Yeah-oh. Godus was an incredible failure. Here's a short list of its problems. Launched with a buggy alpha, followed by buggy betas. Long periods of no updates except to add rampant microtransactions to a game with few features to begin with. Molyneux claimed that the mobile version would be a side project when in fact it was the main goal for maximum profit. Signing with a publisher after raising $800,000 on Kickstarter. Oh yeah, there was a Kickstarter for it. Poor internal management that led to an inconsistent vision. Molyneux announcing projects out of the blue without telling the team what they were. If you check out the Steam page for Godus, or its spin-off, which it just looks like a mod to be honest, you'll find hundreds of reviews slamming them for unfulfilled promises. The most insulting part, I think, is in this video.
Well, there's lots of reasons to do Kickstarter, but one of the big things is people kept saying, you know, you're promising too much, you'll keep on promising too much. I'd have interviews with people like yourself, I get too excited, and then that would turn into a promise.
Video games are exciting.
Well, you know, well, now it's not my promises. It's anyone that invests in Kickstarter is part of the development team. And we are going to be releasing, early in the new year, the first prototype to a lot of the people have pledged on Kickstarter. We're going to be using analytics to analyze the way they play. We're going to be taking their suggestions, already doing daily videos which feeding back on people's suggestions, and we're going to incorporate in the game. So it's not my promises. It's all of us.
You're passing the blame on to everyone.
Yeah, I am. You know,
if a promise doesn't get it in, it's everyone's fault.
If you pledge, then you know it's as much your fault as it is my fault.
Yep, if you paid for Molyneux's team to develop a game, it's actually your fault that it didn't happen. I mean, why did you fund something with your own money? It's like he has any kind of responsibility? Don't be crazy. If I had a nickel for every time an accredited game director had a disastrous Kickstarter project, I'd be rich enough to buy the diamond chisel from Curiosity What's in the Cube. In any event, what happened to Henderson? Well, what's funny is that in most articles about the game's failure, he's barely mentioned, which is kind of strange because he was supposed to be the god of gods. I mean, wasn't that the whole point behind this life-changing social experiment? Let's glance at the Wikipedia. However, as of January 2015, Henderson has received little to no contact with 22 Cans, and in light of recent departures from the studio, along with lasting issues with multiplayer, Henderson likely won't be able to collect any portion of the game at all, and once he does, it will only be for 6 months, or even less if another player overthrows him, who then will take a portion of the profits. What? So it turns out that there was a person at 22 Cans who was in charge of communicating with Henderson. That person left, and they didn't replace them. The icing on the cake is that this God of Gods role was dependent on a multiplayer component called the Hub, which was never implemented. Never give Peter Molyneux your money. Ever. Ever again. Let's move on to a social experiment with a more positive outcome. And it may surprise you, but it comes from League of Legends. Now, I played League for about 7 years, and one of the things pretty much every player will see at some point is these loading screen tips before games. I never thought about them for the longest time until I stumbled across some blog post talking about why they're there. See, the game is rather infamous for being a bit of a hotbed of toxicity, but back in 2011, Riot's then lead designer Jeff Lynne wanted to conduct an experiment to see what factors could decrease bad behaviors. There were a few components to this, one of which was the tribunal, where players could vote on whether or not a reported player deserved a punishment. It would ultimately be dissolved a few years later, as it was found to be too exploitable by creating multiple accounts, or even just the voters getting it plain wrong. Their more successful trial was much more subtle. In the so-called Optimus experiment, loading screen tips were added, with 2 main variables, content and color. Messages would be about positive behavior statistics, like this percentage of players punished by the tribunal never offend again. There would be negative ones, too, like teammates perform worse if you harass them. Finally, there was a third, neutral category of fun facts or jokes. These messages would be displayed in different colors, red, blue, and white. These factors would be mixed and matched over the course of a year across millions of games, and Lynne's team found some interesting correlations. It was called the Optimus experiment because it was based around the theory of priming, funny, where one kind of stimulus can affect someone's reaction to another. For instance, a study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology found that students who saw the color red, even for brief amounts of time, decreased in their performance by 20%. Some of the key takeaways from the Optimus experiment were as follows. When players saw positive statistics in white or blue, the level of overall toxicity lowered, while red caused no change. On the flip side, when they saw negative stats in red, their toxicity also decreased. Actually, more in the case of offensive language. When they saw the same negative tips in white, no change. Oh, and seeing a neutral question like who will be the most sportsmanlike in red actually increased toxic behavior way more than other examples lowered it. At the risk of oversimplifying the results, positivity is more effective in cooler colors, warnings are more effective in red, and an innocent question might just aggravate us if it's presented the wrong way. I mean, maybe players felt like it was taunting them? A more full breakdown will be in the description, where I always put my sources if you're curious. I'm just wondering whether or not this priming idea was ever applied in other multiplayer games. Then again, this experiment was back in 2011 and 12, and while it is still present in the game to this day, I don't think anyone would argue the game has gotten substantially less toxic. The last two games we talked about were both intentional experiments, letting something loose in the wild to see how people would interact with it. What about something nobody could have predicted? Not even the developers. In 2005, World of Warcraft was still a fresh face in the MMO landscape, heralding in a new era for the genre. During its 1.7 patch, a new dungeon was added to the Stranglethorn Vale region of the game. This dungeon was Zul Garub, and at its end lay Hakar the Soulflayer, the blood god of the trolls. Part of the fight with Hakar was a debuff he inflicted called Corrupted Blood. This was meant to be like a blood disease that would deal damage over time and spread to other players who got too close. If you did get close, you'd be reinfected, so players were supposed to spread apart and social distance until the timer ran out to sustain minimal damage. Now, dungeons in World of Warcraft are instanced, meaning that they kind of take place in their own pocket space, separate from the rest of the world. This is to ensure that every group that goes in has their own experience, and a random person can't just come walking in like that video of George Lucas. It also means that once you leave, your character's status is reset, so as soon as you're done, you teleport out, no more corrupted blood. However, there was a catch: a developer oversight. There were two classes able to summon pets during battle, hunters who summoned beasts, and warlocks who summoned demons. If a pet was inflicted with corrupted blood and dismissed before the timer ran out, they would still have it when they were resummoned, even outside of the dungeon. So it starts simple. A hunter or warlock fights a car, their pet gets this debuff, they happen to dismiss them, win the fight, and when they come out, they decide to kill some monsters. They summon their pet, and oh surprise, it still has the disease. Now, it's not a big deal, you just wait for it to run out. But if you do it near an NPC who happens to be standing by the road, they get it too. That's right, due to another oversight no one could have predicted, the debuff could spread to non-player characters. And because they're just fixtures in the world, they basically became constant vectors for the disease. A player would go up to get a quest from them, and then bam, you're infected before you even knew it. The corrupted blood would spread between large groups of players until it was a legitimate pandemic, dubbed the Corrupted Blood Incident, or the Blood Plague. Major cities became hotbeds for infection, and the streets were quickly lined with players' dead characters. Now, obviously deaths in WoW aren't permanent, but because the debuff was tuned to only be survived by the high-level players doing Zul'Gurub, it would kill low-level players in an instant. This, combined with the constant running around of people trying to avoid the disease, meant that many were stuck in constant death loops. Players' reactions were varied. Some tried to flee to the countryside. Those who could heal others stuck around to try and keep them alive long enough to survive the debuff. Some who couldn't help directly would help guide people to safety. Those curious would hazard their own health to pop in and check out these streets of dead players, and still others tried to intentionally spread the plague. In response, Blizzard tried to enforce a voluntary curfew, advising players to log off or otherwise retreat to remote areas. The plague lasted a full week before Blizzard just decided to reset the affected servers. When they came back online, pets were no longer able to be inflicted with corrupted blood. In the aftermath, there was a lot of discussion from epidemiologists about using this case as a model for a real-world pandemic. Nina Pfefferman of Tufts University was a vocal supporter for the idea. She argued that online multiplayer games could solve a lot of problems inherent to the theoretical models used by researchers. Still, there is a debate as to whether or not the actions of players are really indicative of real-world behaviors, like the griefers who tried to spread it to others. I mean, like, who would catch a dangerous, infectious disease and then just recklessly head into a crowd of people? Thank you so much for watching. If you yourself have any curious observations about people that you've noticed through online games, I would love to hear them in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and I don't have an outro, so bye.